Hi, everyone. Good morning from Chicago. And whatever time of day it is where you are, we're so happy to have you here with us for the Pediatric Cancer Data Commons third annual public webinar, Connect, Share, Discover, How Democratizing Data is Changing Research. The theme of our webinar today is impact. If you happen to have joined us for either of our past two annual webinars, you'll know that we focused a lot those years on the process of building the PCDC. This year, we're excited to talk to you about how our approach to making data more accessible is already having an impact and where we're setting our sights next. Just a few housekeeping notes here. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom to enter any questions that you have throughout the webinar. And we're going to address these in a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, and we'll have a few additional members of the PCDC team joining us for that. But please don't think you have to wait until the end to enter your questions. You can enter them throughout, and don't be shy. We have plenty of time scheduled for Q&A, and we really love answering your questions. We will send around a recording of this webinar afterward, and we will make all the materials from today available on our website so you can rewatch or share with a friend. And finally, when this webinar ends today, a survey will pop up in your browser, and we'd really appreciate your feedback. As you can see, we have a full agenda today. We're especially looking forward to welcoming all our guest speakers who were so kind to join us today to talk about their areas of expertise. And with that, I'll hand things over to the Director of the Pediatric Cancer Data Commons, pediatric oncologist, Dr. Sam Volchenboum.
Great. Thanks so much for being here today. And we're super excited to have everybody. It's hard to believe it's been a year since our last public webinar, and so much has happened, and we've made so much progress. And we're super excited to tell you about what's happened, but even more excited to tell you about where we're going and how our vision is evolving for the PCDC. On the next slide is a picture of our team. And you can see that we've grown. We have almost 20 people on the team now, and we continue to hire and bring on more excellent team members to tackle all of the interesting and fun problems and opportunities that we face as we build these international platforms. Our team is made up of technologists and data standards experts and developers and project and program managers and governance and legal experts. So, we've really, I think, put together sort of this perfect group to tackle these issues, which have been such a challenge for groups for so many years. And we're really lucky to have this group together. And you'll be hearing from some of these team members today. On the next slide is some of the groups that have funded us over the years. This past year, we were really lucky to continue to get funding from Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, Rally, St. Baldrick's, Children's Cancer Research Fund, and many others, Team Brightside, and the other groups listed here. We're just so fortunate that that foundations have been so willing to step up and fund, which essentially is infrastructure work. It's building platforms to help collect and share data. That's not always been a popular way to raise funds. So we've been very lucky. Recently, we've even been able to get funding from the National Cancer Institute and from Leidos through contract mechanisms, because the work we've done is now being recognized as helpful on the national landscape for building the nation's infrastructure for sharing cancer data. So in that respect, we've been very lucky, and we continue to be completely indebted to our funders now and going forward. Our mission has been to connect groups together, to allow them to share data. But really the goal, of course, is to help cure more kids with cancer. And as you see over the course of the morning, our mission is starting to evolve, and it's not just about curing more kids with cancer. It's about discovering new ways to do research, new ways to treat people with various cancer and other various diseases. So I think we're really hitting upon the perfect time to be harnessing this type of mission. So we talk a lot about democratizing data, and for us, the democratizing data comes down to these 5 key areas, which I'll go through on the next slide. So we talk about data accessibility, and for us, accessibility is it's all kinds of things, right? I mean, we have data that are locked down in siloed areas, locked down in electronic health records, locked down in case report forms. And so we want to really lift the barriers to getting at those data. We want to make data more accessible, but it's not just a matter of throwing a bunch of data into a database, or sometimes what's called a data lake. It's making data that's usable. I mean, the data have to be very carefully collected and combined and aggregated and harmonized, all the things that you've heard me talk about a million times. The data have to be usable to be interoperable. You know, we all know that there are extreme examples of inequities in healthcare, both in how healthcare is administered and in outcomes. And the data we have doesn't always reflect the diversity of the data. I think you've heard me and others here talk about how most of the kids in the world who have cancer are in countries with very limited resources. Most of the kids who die of cancer actually are often never diagnosed with cancer because of the lack of funds for those types of things. So we really need to think about diversity, both in how the data are collected, how they're used, who gets to use the data, and so forth. And so that's become a real driver for us. We talk about responsibility we have toward everybody using data in the right ways. And we talk about allowing people to do the right thing and to make it easy. So people are always going to take the path of least resistance. So when somebody builds a form for collecting data, they may collect it just in their own form, in their own vocabulary, which makes it completely inoperable. We want to make it super easy so that when people want to collect data, they can do it in the right way, a way that's standardized. And so lowering that barrier, I think, is important. And all of these things then lead to having the most impact. And we'll talk a little bit later about what impact really means. Having the data achieve its maximum potential, whatever the goal is, that is our end goal, is to give people the ability to have the most impact with their data. So with all that being said as introduction, I'm going to pass off to Kat Blumhardt, who's our PCDC program manager, and she is going to go over an overview of where we've come this past year. And I think you'll find it really exciting, the strides that we've made. So over to you, Kat.
Hi, thanks, Sam, for the introduction. As Sam mentioned, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the progress the PCDC made over the last year since our last webinar last May. So here on this first slide, you can see the 9 cancer types and cancer predisposition that make up the pediatric cancer data commons. Each of these groups includes international leaders in their fields who have come together with the common goal to make pediatric cancer data more accessible and usable with the PCDC resources. Next, you can see the PCDC progress tracker, which will be familiar to many of you. This shows where each consortia is within the process. For these groups, we have 7 complete data dictionaries, as you can see in that second column. We have 8 fully executed memoranda of understanding in that third column. And we have data in the commons for 2 disease consortia with 3 more in progress, and that's in the 5th column. If you look closely, you can see small numbers on the last 2 columns representing the 32 analyses we have in progress and the 65 published papers using PCDC data or PCDC workgroups. Then here you can see all of the things highlighted in gold are the progress points that have been either completed for the first time or have increased in number over the past year at the PCDC. So lots of things have been happening. All of this progress is possible due to cooperation and collaboration from many international groups. On this slide, you can see the groups who are committed as data contributors. We have partnerships with groups on 5 continents, and we are rapidly working to build relationships with more groups and individuals around the globe. And then on the top here, we have the total numbers of executed data agreements. We have 6 executed master data use agreements with 15 addenda in the US, 3 master data use agreements with 5 addenda internationally, and a total of 17 data contributor agreements. So the data contributor agreements allow other cooperative groups or institutions to share their data with the PCDC, and that's how we get our data in the commons. And the data use agreements allow the PCDC to share data with researchers who have approved projects by the executive committees. Those approved projects generally lead to publications, and you can see a selection of recent publications here. These are papers done using both data from the commons as well as consensus papers resulting from the consortia work groups. The PCDC team has also worked on 2 papers over the last year. The first is focused on the formation of the commons and the critical role of data commons in pediatric cancer research. The second created an inventory of pediatric cancer collaborative groups around the world. Dr. Ajay Major and Dr. Kathy Pritchard-Jones will highlight lessons learned and potential extensions of this work a little bit later in the program. Also this year, the PCDC completed preliminary launches for 2 platforms that we have been building, the PCDC data portal here on the left and GEARBox on the right. The PCDC data portal went live in September with Instruct data, and data from several other consortia is in progress and being loaded. The PCDC team is working closely with the Scientific Advisory Committee and all the consortia to finalize a pilot for visualization tools within the portal. The GEARBox platform is currently in a pilot phase as well, with new updates being made all of the time. Each of these will have much more detail later in the program as well. Finally, part of the PCDC's mission is to foster reproducible standards in our data dictionaries. To that end, our team works with the US National Cancer Institute Thesaurus, or NCIT group, to match our data elements to existing data elements in their thesaurus, or to create new terms when that's necessary. Over the last year, the Hodgkin lymphoma and osteosarcoma data dictionaries were integrated with the NCIT, which brings the total to 5 PCDC data dictionaries that are aligned with the NCIT. As more dictionaries are completed, we plan to continue to align with the NCIT and promote common standards across pediatric cancer. And with that, I think that brings me to the end of my overview. Dr. Jamie Flerlage is going to talk a little bit more about 2021 and 2022 highlights, and specifically the Scientific Advisory Committee. Dr. Flerlage is a pediatric hematologist, oncologist specializing in Hodgkin lymphoma at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. She is one of the co-chairs of the PCDC Hodgkin Lymphoma Consortium named Nodal, and a co-chair of the newly formed PCDC Scientific Advisory Committee. Go ahead, Jamie.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for taking time to join today. It's my absolute pleasure to present to you some updates and highlights from our Scientific Advisory Committee. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to start with saying that, we really have 2 advisory bodies for the PCDC. Only one of them is the Scientific Advisory Committee, and this consortium has representatives and domain experts with knowledge of the PCDC. Our goal is to provide strategic and operational guidance on our PCDC efforts, and we had our first meeting this past year in November of 2021. We also have a second advisory body, which is our External Advisory Board. This is incredibly important, and those who are on this, their membership is really made up of people with clinical expertise, data science expertise, and digital health experts who are not at all affiliated with the PCDC. As with many external advisory boards, this is very important so that they can truly provide external advice, see the big picture, and they are not our specific content experts. That allows them to ask very meaningful questions and help us grow. The goal of this is to share experience and offer high-level strategic advice on many different pieces for the PCDC. Our first meeting is excitingly planned for autumn of this year, and charters in the nomination process were developed with feedback from all the consortia representatives, and we're very, very grateful for all of the input. Next slide. So what is the purpose of this Scientific Advisory Committee? It is incredibly important to ensure that the PCDC has appropriate, sustainable, and ethical approach to linking data across diseases and data types. As many people are giving us the privilege of sharing this data with us, really taking this to heart, how do we utilize this data best? And how do we make sure that we're adequately and appropriately protecting this data? Our goal is to build and refine the data commons with all these different data elements, while also maintaining independence for each individual disease consortia and their own scientific direction. That's a representative and reflection of where that field for that disease needs to go. A goal is to include representative key stakeholders in advising our PCDC. Again, there will be growth along the way. And also to maintain the autonomy and scientific direction, as I mentioned, of each individual clinical disease consortia. Next slide. We are very grateful that we have a wide representation as founding members on the SAC. We have more than 10 countries and 4 continents represented. The people who comprise this are leaders from each of the PCDC disease-specific consortia. They're leaders from international oncology cooperative groups. Importantly, there are statisticians and ethicists, and maybe most importantly, there are patient advocates as well. We have members at large, including early career investigators. We really need to foster the next generation and help and ensure that early investigators are part of this incredible initiative. As you can see on the right on the map, almost 60% of the people involved are not from the US. And this is very important as a US-based initiative getting started, really to let us grow and make sure we are taking all of the global ideas and consortia into account. Next slide. You can see the laundry list of members. Most importantly, on the second column, it says the group that they're representing. The next column is their country. And you can see just from the map that we have a wide range of groups as well as regions of the world represented on our SAC. Next slide. So I'm very grateful and honored to be a co-chair together with Daisuke Tomizawa. He is from Tokyo, Japan, and he is a member of Interact, which is the AML pediatric consortia. We are grateful to work together and be part of this. We cannot give any credit for the foundation of this, which is from the University of Chicago in Sam Volchenboum's leadership, but we are grateful now to be a part of this and to be co-chairs of the SAC. Next slide. Our most recent meeting, to keep you up to date, was in March of this past year. We reviewed nominations for the External Advisory Board. I mentioned our first meeting of this board won't be till autumn of this year. And very importantly, we discussed protecting the privacy of patients with data in the PCDC. And what that means, in some examples we talked through, are making sure for some of these diseases, they are rare. And some of the subgroups are even more rare. We all spend a lot of time in the clinical world every day, making sure we protect patients' identity, confidentiality. And as we put data into a large data commons, how do we make sure we continue to do that as effectively as possible? So one thing we talked about is how do we minimize potential re-identification of data or of an actual person? And for these more rare diseases, maybe we need to implement minimal sample size reporting, meaning it won't go down to just a 1 patient level, so that if there is only 1 patient with that disease, they could not be re-identified through the tools of PCDC data exploration. So again, many very important discussions. As more data goes in, more topics will come up, and we'll be able to utilize representation from both all the different disease entities in the world through our SAC meetings. Our next meeting is in June of 2022, and very importantly, we will welcome our first patient advocate to the committee. Over time, I think we have all grown to recognize the importance of patients and families and their voice. As we grow this data commons, it is patient data. It is not our data. And so making sure they have a voice, they have a say, and maybe as you bring a different perspective, different set of questions, and a different way of looking at things to the table. So we're very grateful for this addition, this coming meeting. Next slide. This is just representation of our pictures. This is the digital world that we live in. This was our meeting from back in March. We are hopeful that eventually we will meet in person, but a silver lining of COVID has been our sort of growing ability to host these virtual meetings, because we do have global representation and it would be impossible to regularly meet in person. And so as we've all become more tech savvy, you can notice our fancy backgrounds and all sorts of things. It's been really great to be able to connect on a regular basis Across many time zones, and giving credit to many who are up during the night, at least half of us are up at night every time we have a meeting. People are super invested in this initiative. This is a representation, if you recognize any of these faces, these are disease experts from all around the world who have committed their time to a mission of coming together to share data, to further the field, and to help science. And we're very grateful for that and for their time. And with that, I will close and you can go to the next slide. I'm grateful to be here. I'm grateful for this initiative and thank you for the opportunity to share today.
So I am lucky enough to introduce the next section, and I want to bring on Ajay Major. Ajay came to us as a oncology fellow, and an oncology fellow on the adult side. So you know, we've usually been working with peds oncologists, and Ajay was very interested in working with the PCDC and took on some of the most difficult tasks that we had in helping us really at a point in our development when it was critical to have the kind of expertise and domain expertise that Ajay could provide. He then took on the reins of writing what I think is one of the most difficult papers I've ever been involved with. And I'm happy to say that I didn't have to do a lot because Ajay really took it on and did a tremendous job really getting a hold of something that I didn't think was possible, which is the entire landscape of pediatric oncology clinical trials around the world. We're very fortunate to have a world-renowned speaker here today to talk about that work, and introducing Dr. Pritchard-Jones is Ajay Major. And so I just wanted to give Ajay that brief introduction and to give him my thanks for all the work and wonderful help he's given the PCDC. And just has been a pleasure to work with him. So over to you, Ajay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Volchenboum. I really appreciate it. So my name is Ajay. I'm a third-year hematology oncology fellow here at the University of Chicago. I'm elated for the opportunity to introduce Professor Kathy Pritchard-Jones for her talk this morning. And to set the stage, I want to talk a little bit about the work that we've done at the PCDC to map the burden of childhood cancer on the global stage and kind of how PCDC intersects with much of the work that PSYOP is doing. Next slide, please. So there's an estimated around 397,000 annual cases of childhood cancer globally, and there's certainly a higher burden in low-resource nations. You can see here, this is from our paper. Central and South America, Africa, and Asia represent a disproportionate proportion of those cases. And outcomes are also very, very widely variable on the global stage. I mean, they are often 90% or higher in high-resource nations, but can be 50% or even lower in low-resource nations. And this has been a huge, major target of intervention by pediatric cancer groups like the COG and PSYOP, to mobilize some really foundational resources for these nations to improve not only diagnosis and treatment, but also supportive care is a huge component as well. Next slide, please. So one of our foundational missions at the PCDC is to support that overarching goal. And we're improving cancer outcomes by enabling some of this international data linkage and harmonization to help some of these regions build cancer registries so that researchers can more easily study outcomes, conduct research across the entire spectrum, including dissemination and implementation work, and also to perform clinical trials. And this is a huge, key component of cancer outcomes work, to have that infrastructure be able to share those data and analyze those data. And so a question we really asked ourselves is, with whom do we collaborate on the first kind of part of that harmonization process? Who are the existing databases? And really, most importantly, who are the stakeholders that we can work with to start to build some of these frameworks? Next slide, please. And so in that vein, we conducted an international mapping study of pediatric cancer clinical trial groups outside North America and Europe, really looking at these areas and seeing what work is being done. It was published earlier this year in JCO Global Oncology with numerous international collaborators who I know I saw some on the call today. Thank you so much. From various pediatric cancer consortia. And in this review, really, we identified numerous groups worldwide that are performing really high quality registry and clinical trial work, and found that when collaborations between these groups or between these groups and larger international consortia like the COG or PSYOP, they were really most successful when there was a really nuanced understanding and mobilization of local stakeholders. There really isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to collaboration. And as detailed in the manuscript, this really sets the stage for how groups like the PCDC can start to interact with these groups and start to build some of these foundational databases. Next slide, please. And so SIOP has really led the movement towards collaboration with many of these groups. It's great, with great pleasure that I am able to introduce Professor Kathy Pritchard-Jones, who's actually the president of SIOP. So Professor Pritchard-Jones is a professor of pediatric oncology at the University College London, Great Ormond Street Institute of Child Health in London, where she leads clinical and translational research in childhood kidney cancers. Her leadership of the SIOP Renal Tumor Study Group has been really phenomenal and has supported the design of adapted treatment regimens for Wilms tumor and clinical studies to evaluate their implementation throughout sub-Saharan Africa and through the CanCare Africa Research Network. During her tenure as president of SIOP, she's been instrumental in expanding SIOP's new strategy, which is the Program for Advancing the Research Capacity, or PARC, for pediatric clinical trials in low and middle income countries, which is something that we identified as happening in our manuscript, and being able to really provide the resources for those groups to continue generating these adaptive treatment protocols is so foundational. And so thank you again for the opportunity to introduce Dr. Pritchard-Jones, and please join me in welcoming her for her talk today.
Thank you very much, Ajay. First of all, I want to thank Sam Rockelbaum and his team, for the opportunity to speak in this annual webinar day, and also to congratulate you on what is a truly impressive initiative, and to see just how much progress you've made in a relatively short space of time, I would say, given the enormity of the task you've taken on and the fact that it involves personal human healthcare data, which, as I'll talk about in a moment, is quite a challenge to work with.
Thank you, Kathy.
So I would like to just really re-emphasize the need for a global approach. I think Sam and Ajay have already talked about this. And I want to make, sort of give you 4 key messages, really. I'm sure many in the listening audience understand the value of clinical trials, but there's huge scope for added value by secondary use of completed clinical trial data sets. I want to emphasize the importance of global collaboration that embraces low and middle income countries, because we all, I think, appreciate that being clinically research active goes hand in hand with improving survival rates and clinical outcomes for your patients at a population level in a country. And finally, I want to emphasize the importance of involving parents and childhood cancer patients and survivors in research, particularly around that which involves their own data. So next slide, please. So I want to give you an example from the United Kingdom. This was a paper published by the lead epidemiologist of the National Childhood Tumour Registry, Mr. Charles Stiller. And it was really to coincide with looking back over the existence of having a National Children's Cancer Professional Society across the United Kingdom, which started in 1977. And it's a very interesting paper with a lot of data in it. And he's able to show that the improvements in population survival at a country level mirrored the survival rates that were being reported by the clinical trials that were going on during those time eras. And I've just highlighted here the data for neuroblastoma, which is one of the most challenging childhood cancers beyond the age of 1 year. And you can see back in the early 1980s, there were no clinical trials. We then started getting involved with European studies through the work of John Pritchard and others. And even now, this graph actually finishes in 2005, but we know that survival rates are still improving in high-risk neuroblastoma, but still this is a challenging disease. But the point I want to make is that the culture, having had a national childhood professional group, was we know we need to network and work together, treat children according to a common protocol, agree on the important questions, try to collect data that will answer those questions, and then continue to move forward. Next slide, please. And the key message from this study is that clinical trials are good for you if you're a cancer patient. And we have a widely held, I think more than opinion, there is evidence that taking part in clinical trials is considered best practice for most newly diagnosed childhood cancer patients now. And this study just re-emphasizes that the proportion of children taking part in trials has gone hand in hand with improvements in survival. because at the beginning of the period, maybe only a quarter of all children in the country were able to go into an open first-line study. And by the end of the period, it's probably around 90% for most of the childhood cancer diagnostic groups. So that's a huge amount of data. And I sometimes think, you know, have we as a nation made enough use of it? Next slide, please. Now, you've got similar data published for the United States. And this was led by Malcolm Smith, Greg Riemann. This is actually looking, the blue line showing the decrease in mortality rates, so the opposite of survival, over a similar sort of time period. And of course, this also suggests that improvements are beginning to plateau. Next slide, please. But the challenge is that both survival and mortality rates are not equitable for childhood cancer. This is a figure taken that's published by the World Health Organization's Global Initiative for Childhood Cancer framework for how to implement this initiative. And it's actually taken from a paper published in The Lancet by Zach Ward et al. And this is looking at, in fact, at estimated 5-year survival rates by country. Now, of course, these are estimates, because many of these countries have no data collection and don't truly know what their survival rates are to population level. But what you will see is this huge variation, particularly with sub-Saharan Africa and some countries in Asia having very low predicted survival rates. Next slide. Now, to revisit that diagram already showed by Ajay Major, we estimate there are about 400,000 new cases of childhood cancer globally. These are estimates because they're not all diagnosed or counted. And the yellow bar there just emphasizes that over 3/4 of the children with cancer in the world actually live in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. So next slide, please. And when we look at what is their access to clinical trials and opportunities to take part in innovative studies that might generate local evidence in their own setting to improve things, you will see that the distribution of cooperative groups in low and middle income country regions of the world is quite varied. I mean, these groups do exist. And in fact, in this paper led by Carlos Rodriguez Galindo and published back in 2015, they estimate that about over half the world's population live in countries where there are active cooperative groups present in childhood cancer. But of course, they're not running a full portfolio of studies for every diagnostic type, nor can every child in that country access those studies. So that is quite in contrast to what we see across much of Europe and North America. Next slide, please. Now, clinical trials are becoming more and more expensive, not only just in cash terms, but also in terms of professional time and ability to fit in running research studies whilst also holding down a job in clinical care. It's becoming more and more difficult to design clinical studies when subgroups for therapeutic questions are becoming ever smaller. And we do, I feel, have a responsibility to increase the value of all this data that's being collected and is sitting in clinical trial databases, and also think about how we can use routine healthcare data to do more prospective clinical research, and also increase the diversity of the populations included. Because it's all very well to take a therapeutic answer, if you like, that has been developed in North America or Europe, and then try and apply it in a completely different setting. You may get a different answer to the same question. So you definitely need local evidence based on local data. Next slide, please. Now, society definitely expects that data is shared for good purpose with appropriate safeguarding of privacy. The cartoon I found on the right there, you know, it is true that most clinical research, particularly in childhood cancer, is funded by the state in some way, by the public purse. It's people's personal donations, it's their taxpayer money, it's philanthropy. And whilst I don't believe that the average childhood cancer researcher is greedy in the way that that little person on the left is depicted, I think we are all very precious about our data. It's taken us a lot of effort to collect it. We feel we're the only ones who fully understand it. But perhaps most importantly, even though we want to share it, there's a lot of burden and bureaucracy and indeed physical cash cost to your own team to get that data ready to share. So there are barriers to data sharing, but I would like to emphasize that the society and the public expect that we should be doing this. Next slide, please. So I want to give an example of how clinical trial data set reuse or reanalysis has been really valuable. So this is a publication that's now actually over 20 years old, I think, came out in 2001. And there was always this thorny question, you might say across the Atlantic, about what's the best way to treat rhabdomyosarcoma. Should you give radiotherapy right up front for most children, because we know it's quite hard to get clear margins and the disease is locally invasive? Or should you hold back radiotherapy only for those who don't show a good response to initial chemotherapy? And that sort of paradigm question is actually also reflected in something like Wilms tumor that I know a lot more about. But here, 5 study groups who had a completely different philosophy to the timing of the use of radiotherapy were able to put together their data sets to say, should you be giving, or who benefits from having radiotherapy to rhabdomyosarcoma when it affects the muscles around the eye? And of course, that's a very sensitive place to give radiotherapy to, particularly to these young children. And the cosmetic effects can be quite devastating when they become adults. And what you'll see here on the left-hand side survival curve, there was actually no difference in survival rates about whether radiotherapy was given or not. And on the right-hand side, you can see that where radiotherapy was withheld, nearly half the children relapsed. So this sort of comparison actually led to a change in clinical practice, thinking about what's the cost of relapse to a patient in terms of retreatment. Should we think about who needs radiotherapy? Can we identify biomarkers to pick them out more safely? And I just commend this group for, this is one of the first groups that really put their data together more than 21 years ago. But I'm sure it was a huge effort to do this study. And I would like to ask Sam to maybe comment at the end, if you wanted to repeat this study now with the data set that you hold in the Pediatric Cancer Data Commons, just how much easier it would be to look at the same question. Next slide, please. Now, on top of the usual clinical trial data medicine data, we of course now have genomic sequencing commonly done in most high-income countries for children with cancer. And this is yet more pressure, if you like, on the data system. It does allow us to ask questions about, why is there variation both within and between populations? Is there different tumor biology? It also allows us to identify rare subgroups with different outcomes and potentially match patients to more personalized therapy. And most of the data that you need to do these sorts of analyses at the moment are best held in clinical trial data sets, and they are an absolute goldmine. But, and the next slide, please. To answer those sorts of questions, you have to be able to share patient level data. And if that includes genomic sequencing, that makes it even more potentially identifiable. So building trust with parents and patients, it's absolutely key to make this whole research area both targeted on the right questions and also feasible. Next question, next slide, sorry. So I just want to give you another example. In Europe, working with population-based cancer registries, most of whom hold routine healthcare data under statutory permissions, it's been possible to look at overall survival rates from childhood cancer between countries. And this is published work from Gemma Gatta's group in Milan. And the red circles there show the very small difference in survival rates between France and Germany and the UK. And towards the right, in the Eastern European countries that actually have cancer registries that could, with sufficient data quality to be included, you can see that there's quite a big variation in overall survival rates between countries. But all these data tell us are that variation exists in whether your chance of being alive or dead 5 years after a cancer diagnosis in childhood. They don't tell us the reasons why there's that variation. And of course, how much of this difference could be explained because tumors are diagnosed late, so there's advanced tumor stage at diagnosis. Is it tumor biology? You might say in a European population, probably less so. Is it how treatment is accessible and delivered to the patient? Possibly, but then you need very detailed information on how each patient has been diagnosed and treated. And usually that level of detail is not, until recently, very available to population-based registries. And you'll only find that level of detail in a clinical trial data set. So through an international childhood cancer survival by tumor stage project called Benchista, we are now trying to answer that first question: how much of this variation is explained by tumor stage at diagnosis? And Sam will be very pleased to know that we are asking cancer registries around the world to make sure they're talking the same language when they define tumor stage. And it's something called Toronto stage, an international consensus that was developed particularly for population-based cancer registry data, and can even be applied in low-resource countries where the clinical information about each patient may be much more limited. Next slide, please. Now, as part of that, we have been working with children and young people with our National Childhood Cancer Group in the UK and Health Data Research UK to hold some workshops with young people and their carers about understanding data and data sharing. Next slide. And of course, that involves explaining the spectrum of identifiability. I think everyone felt very reassured that their full personal identifiable data is not shared, but we also had to explain why sharing completely anonymized data often doesn't allow certain types of research to be undertaken and to give meaningful answers. And a lot of what we're talking about is that middle fuzzy person where it's still an individual, but it's very, very hard to know who they are. Next slide, please. We also discussed, where do health data items sit? And, right across the patient pathway, from first having symptoms to be suspected of cancer, to being properly diagnosed, to the treatments they had, and then very importantly, what are their long-term outcomes? And a lot of these, understanding the whole trajectory of a patient's journey, the treatment they had if they were left with side effects, of course, requires access to lifelong data. And again, that can be very difficult to get through clinical trials. But some of the data we as clinicians would really like to see in these analytical data sets is not easily available to cancer registries at a national level. Next slide, please. We also discussed the need for consent or not and keeping your data safe. Now, of course, clinical trial data sets have generally been collected with consent, well, always, I would say, collected with consent of the patient or their parents. But often, especially in older data sets, there wasn't specific information about potential secondary use. And I think we all know how difficult it would be to go back to families where a child was diagnosed 10, 15, 20 years ago to try and get their consent and the grown-up child. And of course, some of those children will sadly have died. So we discussed also, how does one, is it okay to use this data without going back for consent? And what does it mean for the person who's still alive now, whose data it is? And again, I think, it was possible to explain the strict rules on how data is stored and used, including who can see it, the fact its quality and safety is checked annually. And I think these are procedures that go on in most countries in the world. Next slide, please. So ultimately, from starting to focus these parent and patient engagement workshops specifically on cancer data, we've come away with a strong support for data sharing from childhood cancer survivors and their families, but a clear message: keep us involved, keep us informed. Next slide, please. So I really do feel that, you know, we have an initiative now in SIOP to help promote clinical research in childhood cancer in low and middle income countries. I think we'd like to see LMICs being able to emulate the path taken in high income countries, that it's through doing research, having better data, quality data about your patients, knowing what you're doing with them and what happens to them is the way that you can improve their survival rates and their quality of survival. And I do believe that what you're doing here now in the Pediatric Cancer Data Commons will be an important part of ensuring that the WHO Global Initiative for Childhood Cancer can really take off and fly. You know, there are many countries who are at the beginning of their journey of cancer data collection, and I think you give them a map and a common language that will help them avoid some of the difficulties we found as collaborative, well-established collaborative groups in working together, and you've provided a platform that will enable that. So my last slide is the next one. Thank you. Any questions? There's my email. Also, I'm happy to answer questions in the chat. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kathy. It's really, really wonderful to get your perspective on this. And you know, meeting you this year and having you become such a staunch advocate for the PCDC has been absolutely wonderful for us. You did mention the Toronto staging system, and we've brought that up a few times in our discussions with data dictionary groups, and we appreciate how that's going to allow us to interoperate across many different data sets. And the Toronto stage, as I understand it, can actually be calculated rather easy from the very granular data that we have. And so I'm glad that you mentioned that, because it's something now that we're talking about in our groups. I just looked at the paper you showed from 2001 with all those data sets from the MMT and IRS groups. And a paper like that now would be, I think, would be quite easy to get the data, because we have now these almost 5,000 patients in the rhabdomyosarcoma data commons, and all the data are already harmonized to a common standard. And obviously you set this up nicely for me to be able to say this, but if one were to request a similar data set now to repeat that analysis from the period from the last 20 years, which is where we have the data from, I think it'd be rather straightforward to do that type of analysis. So I'm very grateful of that. I did want to ask you if people want to try to help address some of the problems in lower resourced countries with abandonment of treatment or access to diagnostics, what are the easiest ways for people to have impact? Because we're asked this a lot. We're often given donations and asked to direct them. What is there's so many groups between WHO and St. Jude and SIOP. What are ways for people to get involved and to have impact, in your opinion?
So I think SIOP has a global health network, which involves multidisciplinary healthcare professionals and scientists around the world. So I think individuals who feel they've got professional expertise to bring, where it doesn't matter where they live, I would urge them to look at the SIOP Global Health information on our website, and to contact the leaders of that. In fact, I think Sagir Khan is one of the participants. He's co-chair of that together with Michael Sullivan in Australia. I think in terms of people who want to bring other types of resources to helping in a global effort, I would urge them to talk to myself and others in the SIOP leadership about our PARC program, because I really do believe that enabling professionals in low middle income countries to be able to run more prospective research studies, even if they're not interventional clinical trials, just starting off with a standard of care and knowing that you're able to deliver it to all your patients, and those who might fail to be able to achieve it, the reasons why is the first place to go. And we'd be very, we're looking for interested stakeholders. And of course, the WHO, St. Jude, yourself, all of us are organizations that have got ongoing projects that can use additional resources, whether it's professional help, donations in kind, donations as money. And I think, just please contact us and we can advise according to who you are.
Appreciate that very much. And we're very much looking forward to expanding our footprint to try to help with some of these efforts and get involved in some of the ways that you suggest. So if people have other questions, please enter them into the Q&A or into the chat. And I think Dr. Pritchard-Jones will be able to hang around a little bit and hopefully be able to address those, or else you can always email her. But Kathy, thank you so much. This was really tremendous, and I appreciate very much your perspective, and we're really looking forward to working with you in the coming years on addressing a lot of these issues. I think we're gonna move on to try to stay on schedule. So thank you, Kathy. I'm gonna bring up Kirk Wyatt. So Kirk, it's interesting that I met Kirk when he was at the Mayo Clinic, and there aren't too many pediatric oncologist bioinformaticians around. It's an emerging field, and Kirk was getting his informatics degree and pursuing his informatics training, and it was just great to bring him on to the PCDC. And he has jumped in headfirst, and despite his clinical responsibilities and switching and moving institutions, he has just been an incredible help for us. And when we needed someone to take on the daunting task of helping develop a timeline and a set of milestones for analytic tool development for the PCDC, Kirk jumped in and took it by the horn. So we're very grateful. What he's going to present represents the culmination of actually about 2 years of intense work in trying to come to some consensus here. And I'm super excited to have Kirk present. So with that, Kirk, I'll hand it off to you and take it away.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Sam. Go to the next slide, please. So as Sam mentioned, I'm going to give you a brief overview of some of the updates on our analytics tools that are on our web-based data portal. And to kind of set the stage, one of the key priorities from very early on was ensuring responsible data access. And what this means is balancing priorities of providing more open access to data and promoting research with the data, while at the same time protecting the patient level data, that line level data, and ensuring that the data are used in a responsible fashion. And one of the ways that we developed to balance these priorities was the project request process. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, any researcher who wishes to access line level data to conduct a research study using data from the PCDC has to draft a project request, a proposal for a project, which is then submitted and reviewed by all of the applicable consortia before finally being approved and having access granted. We can go to the next slide, please. So one of the questions we asked is whether there are ways that we can decrease the barrier to entry to accessing and exploring the data and increase engagement while at the same time protecting the patient level data to protect patient privacy and confidentiality. And what we were aiming to do was to facilitate controlled access to the data prior to the stage where a researcher is submitting a project request. This way, the researcher could explore what sort of data are available, whether those data would be sufficient to answer a specific clinical question, and also to determine sample size and feasibility considerations, such as whether there are sufficient number of patients in the data set to answer a clinical question. And on the next slide, I show an example of the most foundational of these tools, which is live right now. If you go to portal.pedscommons.org, you're able to access this Cohort Explorer. It's accessible to anyone who registers for an account, and it's very easy to use. On the left-hand side, there are filters that you can select to generate cohorts of patients. And on the right-hand side, it will demonstrate the number of patients who meet those filtering criteria, as well as some basic demographic features. And it provides these results instantly, while at the same time not exposing the patient level data. Next slide, please. Now we're very excited to announce that in early June 2022, so in just a few short weeks, we will be launching a Kaplan-Meier survival analysis tool. This is a tool that will allow users to generate Kaplan-Meier survival curves with cohorts of patients that they generate on the Data Commons data portal. And it will facilitate early hypothesis exploration. You could see a screenshot of what it'll look like on the left-hand side there. And this will be accessible via a pilot launch. We can go to the next slide. So when we first proposed the idea of a Kaplan-Meier survival analysis tool to the member consortia, there were a number of concerns that were raised about ways that such a tool could potentially be abused or misused. And this led to discussions over the course, as Sam mentioned, of the last couple of years, where we've been trying to do a risk assessment to identify what are some of these risks and what are some safeguards that we could put in place to prevent misuse or abuse of these tools. And our member consortia have been very instrumental in performing this risk assessment and helping us to develop safeguards that are sensible. These safeguards include education. We feel it's very important to increase data literacy. So we have a number of educational materials, including a statistical manual and some video tutorials that we've launched. There are some governance controls, some technology controls, and user access controls that we're also implementing. And all of these safeguards are going to be assessed in a pilot launch. So this launch that we're doing right now is not the final launch. It's a pilot where we are looking to implement these safeguards and assess their effectiveness so that we can inform future iterations of this tool and other tools. And so as a part of the pilot, users have to agree to abide by the terms of the pilot, including our newly developed acceptable use policy. Go to the next slide, please. So I hope you've enjoyed that very brief whirlwind tour of our analytics tools. As I mentioned, I encourage all of you to go to portal.pedscommons.org. Right now, you can use the Cohort Explorer. This tool is live and accessible to anyone who registers for an account. And then in the next few weeks, have a look out for the Kaplan-Meier survival analysis tool. And before I hand things back over to Sam, I just wanted to express my gratitude for the member consortia and the scientific advisory committee. All of the member consortia, as I mentioned, have been very instrumental in helping us to think through some of these issues and to develop these safeguards. And we continue to work as well with the scientific advisory committee to ensure that we're implementing these tools in a responsible fashion. So with that, I thank you for joining us, and I'll hand things back over to Sam.
Yeah, thanks, Kirk. And as you can see, this was an incredible effort. Kirk, I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but beyond survival curves, where do you think this should go? Like how much of the analytic spectrum should we think about moving into? And there's a lot of platforms out there, and there's a lot that we could do. What direction do you think that is your vision that we should be taking this?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Sam. One of the additional tools that we've been looking at developing is a demographic table generator. And I think as we talk about data standards, one of the things that we really noticed is that when you have these data in these standardized formats, it becomes really easy to pass it off to another tool. And so, for example, a lot of institutions are using tools like Tableau, and they pull their data in and they're able to access this full suite of visualization tools. So, I think a lot of this would be informed by feedback from our users, and that's part of the goal of the pilot, is to see how useful these tools are and whether users prefer to use tools that are on our web-based data portal, or if they prefer to just submit a project request and export the data and do the analysis on their own. But I think with having the data in a standardized format, it's going to make it, I'm not going to say trivial, but much easier to be able to port the data to different visualizations in a relatively easy fashion.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that's the dream, right? If somebody wants to use Cavatica or CBio Portal or the tools that the GDC has developed, that they should be able to leverage those tools. And the steps you've taken over the past year and a half, 2 years have really put us along that path. So we're very grateful for your help, Kirk, and looking forward to hearing more.
Thanks, Sam.
Okay, so next I have the pleasure of introducing Raj Venkatramani, and Raj is going to talk to us about his experience with the PCDC portal. Raj did not one, but 2 pediatric residencies, first at King's College and then the second at my alma mater at University of Illinois, finished up his fellowship training at CHLA. He's now at Baylor, at Baylor College of Medicine. He's section chief of oncology and directs the rare tumor programs at Texas Children's. Importantly, he's the scientific chair of the COG Soft Tissue Sarcoma Committee. So that gives him an incredible viewpoint over which to think about how these tools are developed and used. He's been an incredibly active and participatory partner with us in developing ways to use the PCDC, and we're incredibly grateful for his feedback on the way that the tools are being used. And so we asked him to come today to give his perspective as a user and to inform everyone here today about his experience in leveraging the tools that we've been developing. So with that, I'll hand it off to you, Raj. Thanks so much.
So good morning, everyone. First of all, before I start, I want to thank Sam and PCDC team for inviting me to this meeting. And I was really impressed with the talk so far, especially Dr. Pritchard-Jones' talk, which gave a global overview, and it's going to put in context what I'm going to say here. To be honest, I didn't know what exactly I was supposed to do in this talk, but it's a user perspective. So I want to talk about how we are planning to use the data in PCDC for soft tissue sarcoma. So I titled this talk as Using Instruct to Improve Sarcoma Outcomes. We are very, very excited as a sarcoma community about PCD's, the Instruct database. Of course, we are going to start analyzing this summer, so we cannot wait to start analyzing the data. And a lot of the slides are courtesy of Dr. Doug Hawkins, so I want to give him the credit as well. So again, I want to acknowledge the leadership of Instruct. So I didn't have any role to play in it, but Dr. Hawkins and leadership from Europe are instrumental in starting it back in 2017, along with Sam. And now it's a very mature structure. So the chairs are Gianni Bisagno from EPSSG, Doug Hawkins from COG, and Eva Koscielnik from CWS. And there are various representatives from other cooperative groups in Instruct, Executive Committee. And the way it's organized is different discipline groups are organized as working groups or committees within Instruct based on pathology, biology, or non-rhabdo surgery, statistics, radiation oncology, and imaging. And this has actually served very well and increased the participation from different discipline groups, not only from oncologists. In fact, non-oncologists are more active in Instruct than oncologists so far, pediatric oncologists. And there are 4 main groups involved in Instruct, which is Children's Oncology Group from North America, EPSSG, CWS, and MMT from Europe. And so far, the data portal, which was shown before, a screenshot of which was shown before, there are 4,600 patients, data from 4,600 children with rhabdomyosarcoma is already there. And I got an email last night from Susie Buzz about we are going to add EPSSG data as well. So by May 24th, we're going to have what 7,000 children's data in this data portal. So we are very, very excited about it. There are certain things we have to understand when we look at this data. There are some fundamental differences between the way children with rhabdomyosarcoma are treated on both sides of Atlantic. While this makes combining the data, analyzing it a little bit more difficult, it actually provides us a chance to compare different treatment approaches at the same time without actually doing a very big randomized clinical trial in this very rare population or doing a multinational clinical trial, for example. So one of the examples I can tell you the way the treatment approaches differ is in US, COG uses what you call as a VAC backbone, which is vincristine actinomycin dicyclophosphamide. That has been the backbone for rhabdo treatment for the last 40 years nearly. And in Europe, the backbone is ifosfamide vincristine actinomycin D. The outcomes haven't been that different based on published studies, but there's a fundamental difference in the chemotherapy regimens used in Europe and US for rhabdomyosarcoma. The duration of treatment has traditionally been different. In US, we give 42 weeks of chemotherapy, while in Europe, the induction treatment consists of about 27 weeks of chemotherapy. And in US COG regimens, we don't give any maintenance treatment traditionally. Now, lately, we have started including maintenance treatment in the latest clinical trials, but the Europeans have tested maintenance treatment for the last couple of decades. So we have data about patients who have maintenance therapy and patients who didn't get maintenance therapy from US. So there is an opportunity to compare patients treated the same time period, where some of them got maintenance therapy and some of them did not get maintenance therapy. And the general philosophy in children's oncology group is upfront surgery if you can do it. And the general philosophy in Europe has been delayed surgery for patients with soft tissue sarcoma, including rhabdomyosarcoma. So there is an opportunity for us to compare outcomes of patients who get upfront surgery versus delayed surgery. And in children's oncology, traditionally, we have 3 different risk groups for rhabdomyosarcoma. We call it low risk, intermediate risk, and high risk. And Europe, there has been low, intermediate, high risk, and very high risk. They have 4 risk groups. So as you can see, it can be confusing when you're reading the papers or looking at data, because the same patients may be called intermediate risk in COG protocols, and the same patient may be called high risk or very high risk in European protocols. So this PCDC, the database gives us a unique opportunity to compare different definitions of these patients and then come up with international risk stratification, which is one of the main goals the INSTRUCT was started, is instead of having different risk stratifications in Europe and US or anywhere else, to develop a common risk stratification so that we can compare, even if the future clinical trials don't use the same chemotherapy regimen, at least we can compare patient to patient, the same patients with the same risk factors. And we basically plan to INSTRUCT has data from about mid-1990s onwards. So we are able to compare those data. And our aim is to finish this risk stratification, or at least the initial analysis of risk stratification, by summer of 2022. And our statisticians are the ones, both sides of Atlantic are leading this effort on looking at this data from 7,000 patients. And we are also excited about solving some long-standing questions with using this data, because each individual cooperative groups doesn't have enough patients to solve some of these questions we always had, because these specific subtype of patients or subtype of risk factors are so rare. For example, the sites from which the rhabdomyosarcoma arises are traditionally classified as favorable and unfavorable based on perceived outcomes for these patients. But unfortunately, the sites which are considered favorable in Europe and US are different. And the same thing for unfavorable sites. So now with this combined data, we are able to look at individual sites and decide what they should be classified as, whether are favorable or unfavorable as well. Similarly, there is a tumor size cutoff of 5 centimeter for rhabdomyosarcoma, with that which we say, okay, 5 centimeter or above the size of the tumor, then your outcomes are worse. But we use that cutoff regardless of the age of the patient. If there is a baby with 5 centimeter, we use the same thing, or 16-year-old with 5 centimeter. We know that a baby with 5 centimeters is much larger than compared to 16-year-old with 5 centimeter. But because of lack of patients or the lack of numbers, we have been using the simple cutoff. So when we have more patients, it gives us a better data where we can refine this size cutoff for prognosis for patients. And the other one is an entity called alveolar rhabdomyosarcoma, where they have FOXL1 fusion. The fusion partners we traditionally know, and we have some preliminary data that makes a difference. For example, if you have PAX3 fusion, the patients tend to do worse, and PAX7 fusions actually tend to do pretty well, and they may not have an adverse prognostic, but they're comparable outcome to embryonal rhabdomyosarcoma. So that kind of questions can finally be answered when we have this combined data from both Europe and US. Of course, there are some challenges when you combine this data. The major challenge we find, or so far we have encountered, is missing data, especially when you compare genomics data. Since these are from mid-1995, the genomic data is a lot of them are missing. But we are hopeful as this INSTRUCT goes forward and newer clinical trial data are entered, we'll have more and more genomic data, and we'll be able to use that for classification and prognosis and treatment decisions in future. There has also been some evolving histology classification. The way traditionally it was called embryonal and alveolar rhabdomyosarcoma. Now the alveolar rhabdomyosarcoma term is going away. We are using fusion positive, fusion negative. Even within alveolar rhabdomyosarcoma from 1995 to 2015, the definitions have changed depending on how much tumor tissue is showing a certain characteristics. Previously it was less than 50%, now it's more than 50%, those kinds of things. How do we compare a diagnosis from 1995 to a diagnosis from 2013, when the actual criteria for the diagnosis were different. And then, of course, I already alluded to like different treatment philosophies across the pond. How do we compare that? It's both an advantage and a disadvantage. Advantage in the sense it's like a comparison of different regimens, and we can pick which one is less toxic or more effective, those kinds of things. At the same time, when you compare prognostic factors, those are often determined by how intensive treatment you got. So sometimes when you're trying to classify these patients as risk groups, we have to take into account what kind of treatment they got. So that requires more nuances as well. So there are several projects already in pipeline. We were always expecting this data to be there. Of course, there was some unexpected delay, but we didn't wait for all the data to be there in the database. We already proposed multiple projects to the Executive Council for Instruct, and then these have been already approved. So what we have done is, in anticipation of the data, we have lined up multiple projects we want to do, and there are other projects being worked on as well. So as soon as this data is available, we are ready to go hit the ground running. The other thing which the PCDC group and the Instruct has done is bring these international experts in pathology, soft tissue sarcoma pathology, surgery, radiation oncology, radiology together. And when we came together, when we are waiting for data, what people have done is they combined together and said, well, why don't we publish position papers of what we think is the standard of care? Right, a consensus paper. Of course, it can be different in Europe and COG, but they got together, discussed, and said, "Oh, should be the minimum standard of care." So there has been multiple landmark papers published through Instruct about how do we grade the tumor, how do you give radiation therapy to a specific site, what kind of pathology, what is the minimum pathology factors or things the pathology report should contain when they report about soft tissue sarcoma. So this has been a wonderful addition, in addition to the data collection, bringing of experts together, putting their minds together and publishing various papers, which is useful to the clinicians. And they continue to work on multiple position papers right now, and they're expected to be published in the next few months. And we have already published multiple papers through Instruct. These are some of the papers. These are published without data. As I said, these are opinion papers which have been published even before we had the data. So in conclusion, we are really excited about having all this data from rhabdomyosarcoma, and we soon expect patients with non-rhabdomyosarcoma data to be included in Instruct as well. And this is going to be a huge, rich resource for us. Not only risk stratification, when we plan future clinical trial, we can go back and say, hey, is this question, how do we approach it? And this database is going to be very useful for us for planning future clinical trials, making treatment decisions, and so on. And once we have molecular data in here, it's going to become even more useful. With that, I'd like to thank all the funding agencies for Instruct, Dr. Doug Hawkins, who has been mainly instrumental in putting this group together. Thank you.
Raj, thanks so much. That was absolutely helpful for those of us who haven't used the portal, and for those who don't understand the power of it. You know, I'm wondering, as we think about future trials, one of our dreams, of course, is that we build the standards, we take the old trials and harmonize them. But going forward, do you think, how do we incentivize groups to use the standards in developing the data collection forms, so that when the trials are done all over the world, that the data are already collected in a formalized way? Or do you think we're always going to be relegated to having to harmonize the data afterwards?
So interestingly, some of the groups, again, as I said, all the experts have come together based on Instruct, and they're already talking about what is the minimum required data. For example, our pathologists are already informed based on the interaction Instruct. In our new clinical trials, they're saying, okay, for Instruct, we need this data. So we need to put these data and format it in such a way that it's easier for us to put it in Instruct. So I think we are trying to develop some common data forms as well. Always there's going to be some, I would not say resistance, some resource prioritization in COG, where if we put any data other than what's required for the clinical trial, COG, because they have to spend extra money, so they don't want to include those things, right? We want to include so many other things we want to capture. There's always a prioritization. But since we have interaction through Instruct with Europeans, we are trying to, through that mechanism, say, hey, even if we collect the same data, how do we word it? How do we classify it? Those kinds of things. So that's already having an impact on how we collect our design CRF and COG.
Well, that's a great point. So even if the forms aren't generated exactly the same, just the way that we're thinking about classification is already having an impact. Yeah. And I've been amazed at the group, as we work across the spectrum, many groups tell us it's not going to be possible to get agreement on certain things. And eventually we do come to an agreement. So I think that's been very gratifying. I also forgot to mention that there is a manuscript that we've submitted on the process of developing Instruct, which is in revision now, that Kirk Wyatt authored. So that'll be hopefully coming out in the next few months, so people can actually see the process we went through to develop Instruct. So if they have any other questions for Raj, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A. And if he's still on, hopefully he can answer those questions. And I think we're going to go ahead and move on. So thanks so much for your presentation. It was very, very helpful. Well, I am super excited to talk about a few things, and I'm going to go through some of the existing work and then talk about some of our future work. And I'm even going to talk about things that have little to do with pediatric cancer. So, hopefully we will go on this adventure together over the next 40 minutes or so. So GEARBox is one of the innovations we're super excited about. And GEARBox developed out of a collaboration we have with the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society through their Pediatric Acute Leukemia Project, the PEDAL project. And LLS has funded this project specifically for AML to address the following problem. And this is a problem that as clinicians we face with children with cancer, not just AML, with any type of cancer, that when a child has relapsed or refractory disease and they come into the clinic, we're often left with very few resources to understand what additional therapy is available for that child. And we often will put the child on some sort of holding chemotherapy or some sort of more traditional chemotherapy while we await the process of figuring out, is there a clinical trial? Are there other therapies that the child might go on? And the information that's needed to make those decisions might be genetics from the tumor. It often involves a lot of clinical information, sometimes even germline testing, although less often. But those factors are what go into this idea of a precise or a precision approach to treating that child's refractory disease. Now, of course, this can be applied to newly diagnosed children, but what LLS was very much excited about was, can we provide a platform for clinicians and patients in the refractory or relapse setting to quickly match the child with a clinical trial? So if you go to clinicaltrials.gov and you look up a study, one of the studies that's in our GEARBox is this PEPN 2113 study. This is just a screenshot of some of the inclusion criteria. And it's not even the whole list of inclusion criteria. I would have had to take 2 or 3 screenshots to capture them all. So you could imagine that as a clinician or a patient, going to clinicaltrials.gov, which is a wonderful, rich resource, and trying to pull out all the potential studies, all the inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria, and figuring out what might be a match for your patient, that would be a daunting, difficult task. And that task in and of itself might take days or weeks to go through. And I think many would be challenged to even understand how some of these criteria relate to each other. So it's because of this that we went ahead and came up with the idea of GEARBox. GEARBox is a clever acronym, or initialism, stands for Genomic Eligibility Algorithm at Relapse for Better Outcomes. I can't claim credit for that. I think it came from Andy Kolb, who came up with the acronym. And the idea is that using GEARBox, we want to try to get a child onto a study within 2 to 3 days. And that is a complete shift from the normal paradigm of how we think about taking care of kids in the relapse setting. So the way GEARBox works is it is a website that any clinician can go to. It's publicly available. Anybody can go to gearbox.pedscommons.org. The beta for the LLS GEARBox is open now, and it's up and running. And the way it works is that all the potential patient characteristics are listed on the left, and all of the studies that have been pulled out of clinicaltrials.gov are on the right. And what we have done is behind the scenes, we have used a combination of manual and automated language matching processes to pull out all of those inclusion and exclusion criteria, and then present the clinician with basically a list of potential factors for the clinician to enter. So in this case, on the left, I've entered just some criteria: the patient's age, their weight, the current disease they have, things about their bone marrow test. And as you enter those criteria, the trials start to filter into being matched or unmatched, undetermined. And you can see this in real time. So if you pick a Karnofsky score of 20%, all the trials go to unmatched. And if you pick a Karnofsky score of 90%, they all go to potential match, for instance. So this is a real-time clinical trial match. Now, again, you might say, well, listen, you're not giving me anything that I couldn't already get from clinicaltrials.gov. And that's true. This is essentially a calculator. But man, this speeds up the process immensely. And we've had people come back to us. We had a group from Amsterdam tell us that they actually are using this now during their tumor boards to provide real-time information about potential matches for their patients. On the right, you can see, I'm going to blow this up a little bit, is after you have a trial that's a potential match, you can get more information about that trial, and that more information can tell you, give you a link to the clinicaltrials.gov site for that trial. But more importantly, it can send you to a place where you can get more information about how to enroll the trial. And for the AML trials and for leukemia trials in general, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society has this amazing nurse navigator system that they run, this pediatric clinical trial nurse navigator at LLS, that you can go to, and they will help you understand where the trial is, how to get on the trial, who to contact. And we're actively now thinking about better ways to provide this kind of service across all types of cancers. But for leukemia, this service is already in place. The other thing you can do is, if you click the little information button, is you can get a more sort of geeky view of the system, which can show you exactly why your patient has or has not matched to that trial. And so this shows all of the Boolean logic behind the match. It can actually help you understand what factor it is that was preventing the match. And in the future, we actually hope to provide a system where you can take a single trial and see just the criteria for that trial, so you can understand for any particular trial why your patient's not matching, or how close are they to matching, or what has to change for them to match, and so forth. Now, of course, right now, GEARBox is just a calculator. Like I said, the clinician enters in the values for the patient, and then the patient can match. We have much bigger plans for GEARBox. We want to pull information from the health record. We want to pull information from groups like COG that has a lot of the data. And then we really are interested in pulling in some of the biomarker data that we can get from third parties like Hematologics or Foundation or Tempest and other groups. We think once we build that kind of platform, this moves from being just a calculator to actually being a highly functional real-time clinical trials matching tool that can be used in a very quick way to help patients find matches. Now, I'm sure one of the questions you have is this only for clinicians? Right now, we don't have it locked down. And so a parent or a foundation supporter, anybody can come into the tool and put in criteria and see what's a match and what's not a match. For now, we felt like this was basically presenting information that's already publicly available. We're just presenting it in a much easier to digest way. In the future, of course, we may decide that the tool needs to have different authorization aspects depending on who's using it. But for now, it's open to the public and anybody can use it. We've recently received some funding to expand GEARBox in a couple directions. We're hoping to now bring on some of the other tumor types. Neuroblastoma, rhabdo, osteo, and ALL and germ cell are going to be our starting core. We hope to expand out the trials in GEARBox. If there are trials not in clinicaltrials.gov, we hope to bring them in. And if anybody is interested in helping us with GEARBox, either as a contributor or as a user or a tester, please let us know. We'd love to get more input, and just contact us, and we'd love to have you involved in the GEARBox project. And I'm so excited to come back next year and give you an update, because I think we're going to make great strides in how GEARBox is used and expanded over the next year. Okay, so with that very brief description of GEARBox, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we see as the future for PCDC and where we're going. We have been very lucky to be involved with national projects. For a couple of years, we were helping work on the CCDH, the Center for Cancer Data Harmonization project, which is part of the Cancer Research Data Commons ecosystem. And now we're becoming more involved in projects that are related to the Children's Cancer Data Initiative. Many of you are aware, probably all of you are aware, that the CCDI was announced in 2018 as a $50 million per year for 10 years project. And this is right up our alley. This speaks our language. The whole idea is to make data for pediatric cancer better and easier to use. The idea is to maximize every child's presentation. So not to get mired down in the clinical trials forms for trials, but to really think about all the data collected on the kid when they're diagnosed with cancer, and maybe even the data from before they had cancer and how that relates to their predisposition or their likelihood of getting cancer. Building a connected infrastructure to share and use those data, finding opportunities to make the data more accessible and easier to use, and that involves building the tools and the platforms. So we were, I think, in the perfect place at the perfect time for this kind of initiative, because we were already doing a lot of this work before the CCDI was even announced. There are a lot of groups that collect and use data for pediatric cancer. It's not just PCDC. You're all aware of the amazing Gabriella Miller Kids First project that Adam Resnick and Allison Heath run at CHOP. There are other projects like Casey Green's Childhood Cancer Data Lab and Project Treehouse, and Xingwei Zhang's St. Jude Cloud project with all the genomic data. There are so many amazing pediatric cancer data projects, and our goal, or the CCDI's goal, is to try to connect these together so we can get the maximal use of these data. The NCI is going to be, of course, having pediatric cancer clinical data in their data commons, and we've recently been lucky enough to sign a contract with the NCI and Leidos to provide dictionary services to help do the data harmonization for the data that are going to go into this data commons, and we're going to help the NCI with building and deploying the data models. And we're really excited. We've worked with this group before on other projects, and we think we're going to be able to have a pretty significant impact in how pediatric cancer data are put into the national ecosystem and used. So this is very exciting for us. If anybody's interested in hearing more about this work, happy to answer it during the Q&A, or happy to answer it offline. So for the PCDC, we think this is going to be an explosive year for us. We've been laying the groundwork for building this our interconnected data commons for several years, and we're now finally seeing the fruits of all that labor. Kirk showed you a little bit about the visualization tools, and Raj presented some of the information about the cohort discovery tool. This is all going to come on the scene in the next few months in a big way, our integrated browser and our visualization tools. But something else exciting is happening, and that's our ability to connect to other sources of data. And our neuroblastoma tool in particular will allow you to take data, cohort that you discover in the neuroblastoma tool, and connect it directly to data that's in the genomic data commons, which is on the right here. That is only through innovation that our team was able to develop with the Genomic Data Commons team, the ability to bring up a cohort in one and to match it to a cohort in the other automatically, I think is a tremendous advancement. And it's really now one step away from the goal, which is to provide an analytics environment where all these data can sit and be analyzed together. So it's very exciting, these connections we're making, and we're making connections to other types of data that I'll mention. We are seeing now finally, you know, we all want more data, more data. We're starting to see again, this tsunami coming of data into the PCDC. Since we formed in 2012, 2013, we've seen a massive influx in the number of neuroblastoma cases. I'll remind people of a talk I used to give where I would show how the initial neuroblastoma data was in an Excel spreadsheet. And where you see that dotted line there is where we went from an Excel spreadsheet with collaboration with Sue Cohn into a data commons. And we've now seen a massive increase in the amount of data. And you can see the addition of the rhabdomyosarcoma data there now taking us to, I think most recently, over 30,000 cases in the PCDC. Again, we deal with retrospective data. This is completed clinical trials data. We certainly have plans going forward to access data that are not retrospective from trials, but to get data that are part of the electronic health record, to start to leverage a lot more registry data. And I'm happy to announce that we're starting to bring on more and more collaborators. We have a newly signed agreement with St. Jude, for instance, to bring in data from some of their clinical repository as well. So the data are going to be growing. This is an example of what our integrated cohort explorer is going to look like. This is not publicly available yet. This is our demonstration view. But here on the left, you can see that I have the neuroblastoma INRG and the rhabdomyosarcoma instruct data both listed separately. And so you'll be able to hopefully come here and see all the different consortia listed, and you'll be able to do a search over one or more of these groups together. And to me, this has always been the dream, is to have an integrated portal for the analysis of these data. I said it probably under my breath a few months ago, but the team has really taken off with it. I think we can get to 100,000 patients in the next year. I don't think that's too audacious. We certainly looking over the data that we want to harmonize and looking over the groups we're working with. If we just got the data that's been committed, we would get very close to 100,000, and we're every day meeting new groups that want to contribute data. So hopefully I'll be sitting up here next year announcing that we've hit our 100,000 patient goal, and I think we can get there. And again, it's not just about the number. The idea is that with this increasing number of this increased number of data or patient data, we can just do so much more research, and we can get at the rare subtypes, and we can just learn so much more about pediatric cancer. We're already working with most cancer types. The cancer types here in dark blue are the ones for whom for which we have formal consortia. And you can see that across the board, I think it's about 85% of pediatric cancer that we're working with. We do have goals to work with other groups here. We're working with Dr. Pritchard-Jones on how to get a Wilms tumor data commons set up, and I'm going to be meeting with her group very soon to talk about that. We've had talks with Ted Leitch about a nasopharyngeal carcinoma commons, had talks with a group about a thyroid cancer data commons. So I think these are coming, and I'm very confident that next year when I speak to you that this table will be almost completely filled in. If the other area that we're obviously aggressively moving into is the adolescent and young adult area. And many of the tumors listed here have a very important footprint for AYA patients, germ cell tumor, Hodgkin, and others. And I hope that as we continue to grow, we'll continue to increase the AYA population in our data set. I mentioned working across other groups. And the genomic data commons was the easiest one for us to integrate first because we had this common identifier Plus, we share a common physical footprint with the GDC on campus here at the University of Chicago. So we've had a very close relationship with the GDC group, and it was a natural thing for us to try to combine our data sets. But we've more recently had very constructive conversations with Gabriella Miller Kids First. As I mentioned, they have a tremendous, incredible resource that is populated with genomic data and on kids with cancer and structural birth defects, as well as clinical data. And so we're working with the Gabriella Miller team to figure out a way to connect our systems so that if you're searching in their system, you can see about clinical data that we have that may enrich their data set. And if you're in our system, you might be able to kick over to their system to try to bring in some of the genomics data. And then most recently, we've been very lucky to work with Xingwei and her group at St. Jude to understand how we might connect our systems to share clinical data and genomic data. It's very exciting for us because obviously the St. Jude Cloud is this amazing, beautiful resource with tremendous analytic tools. And we're just very lucky to be working with them and to come up with a way to try to share our resources together. So going forward, I certainly hope that next year, I hope I'm able to give you a very positive update about these collaborations in particular. One area that we get asked about a lot is the idea of survivorship or long-term follow-up. Obviously, in the US, at least, most children with cancer survive. The same is true of Western Europe and other high-income countries. Long-term follow-up is really important to monitor the effects of therapy because most kids will have some sort of chronic health condition after being treated, and a significant proportion of kids will actually have a very serious health condition after treatment. One of the things I'm interested in is understanding how patients have access to their data. I have a general interest as an informatician in patients owning and having access to their data longitudinally in the long term. But this is really critically important for cancer patients. Consider a teenager who is treated for Hodgkin lymphoma, and she gets cured, she goes off to college, and then 10 years later, she presents to her obstetrician pregnant. And she says, I had Hodgkin when I was a teenager, but I don't have information about that. We need a way for these kids and young adults to have perpetual access to their data. Now, there's been a lot of ways that people have tried to do this, and nobody has really solved this problem. So one of the things we're thinking about is how do we leverage our data commons infrastructure to build a system that can give people perpetual access to the information about their cancer. And I think this could be an incredible benefit, not only to that patient, but it could help bolster the data we have in the data commons for long-term follow-up. And it could also provide a two-way conduit where survivors can be asked follow-up questions, or they can submit further data to the data commons. So this is a really, it's a passion project for me, and I think it's going to be an important project for the PCDC. If anyone is interested in helping out with this long-term follow-up idea, we'd love to get more people involved. We're working on some ideas for proposals right now. And we think this is going to be important. It's really important with all the new therapies coming down the line, all the immunocancer therapies and other ways of treating kids that we don't have long-term follow-up data on. So having ways to collect these data are going to be critical. So very excited about survivorship. I'm not sure what kind of update I'll have next year, but these ideas are in the works, and I think it's going to be important for the PCDC. So everything up till now has been pediatric cancer. And I debated whether or not we should delve into non-pediatric cancer topics, because the last thing I want to do is to give the impression that our focus on pediatric cancer is in any way being diluted, because it's not. We are laser focused on democratizing data for pediatric cancer and lowering the barriers to research. But because of the success we've had, we've now been asked to push into other areas that I think are extremely exciting for us. And I think pushing into these areas is going to enhance our ability to collect data for pediatric cancer, and is going to really help bolster our mission. So in the beginning, we talked about connect, share, and cure being our mission statements. We really are now talking about discovery. So we want to connect people. We want to share the data to allow more discovery. We want to maximize the power of this high quality data that's easily accessible to drive discovery and improve human health across the board. And as I mentioned in the introduction, we think about these areas, accessibility, usability, diversity, responsibility, and impact. And I just want to briefly touch on them. And some of you have heard me talk about these paradigms before, but the data just are not accessible. At a recent conference, I asked the audience, I said, who here does not use shadow charts in their electronic health record? And a shadow chart you see there in the middle is a binder full of paper where we keep handwritten notes and consents and other things about the patient. One person in the room of 100 people raised their hands saying that they didn't use shadow charts. So there's no better definition for siloed data than data that are sitting in a 3-ring binder. So accessibility remains an issue. On the left, of course, are these customized collection systems for pharma. On the right is to remind us that we're still faxing things. Data that are faxed, listen, to me, that's a siloed piece of data because now it's an image somewhere, or at best a PDF, but at worst a crooked image somewhere that's sitting in a binder. So we really have to work on accessibility. And I've talked at length about this, and I know that a lot of the work we do is really to help break down these silos. The data have to be usable. If they're not high quality, interoperable data, then they're not of use to anybody. I've shown this picture on the right many times. This is from the Gene Expression Omnibus and how they have age throughout the different data sets. No one standardized on age, so people just picked how they wanted to put age in there. So before you combine data sets, now you have to sit there and try to interconvert something as simple and as basic as age. So you can imagine how it is for things like stage and grade and other parts of the data that are collected. So we talk about data being fair, and fair has been in the literature now for the last couple of years, and it gets at the heart of what makes data useful. The data have to be findable, so they can't be buried somewhere. They have to be accessible, so they have to be downloadable and usable by people that have the correct access. And then interoperable, which is all about the standards. And then finally, we want to be able to reuse data. And that's what we're talking about. We talk about combining data in the PCDC is being able to reuse data that were collected for a different purpose. So think about fair data and the usability of the data. The diversity in the data we collect is absolutely critical. And I'm so grateful for Dr. Pritchard-Jones for going over her experience and thinking about cancer around the world. It's not just about the geographic diversity, but it's about the demographics and the genetic diversity. So much of the data that we collect in our clinical trials are from high-income countries. So many of the treatment recommendations we make and of the algorithms we develop are on a very small subset of kids with cancer. And we really need to start thinking about the diversity of the population of kids that we treat. If we can collect data in the same language and have it in a way that's interoperable, that's really going to allow us to work across borders to share and to really represent all the kids from around the world who have cancer. And this is responsibility is something I've talked about before. I think we have a responsibility to increase the data literacy for anybody who uses or collects data. We have this catchphrase, we want to make it easy to do the right thing. We want to make it easy for somebody building a form to use the standards we develop. We don't want to have them hunted down. We don't want to have people wonder, oh, should I use age in days or age in years, or how should I do this? We want to make it easy for them to figure out how to do it. And if we do this in the right way, it's going to really help across the board, because things like patient privacy and security and HIPAA and GDPR, all these things will fall into place much more easily if we create the ecosystem for people to have access to the resources. Kirk has created a whole set of videos that we're going to be releasing in the next few weeks that go into many of these aspects, and that will be a valuable resource. And it's just one example of the ways that we're trying to increase the literacy in the community. And specifically, when we say data literacy, we mean having people understand why standards are important, or why is it important to build a form in a certain way. That is our goal, because if we can do that throughout the community, it makes our job so much easier. And then, ultimately, this is all about impact. And this is the life cycle of data here at the bottom, everything from where are the data to bringing it together, to understanding how to finally using the data to write papers or to devise new treatment schema. It's all about having impact. Now, right now, we measure our impact generally in terms of the numbers of papers that are published. If you go to our website, you can see there's over 50 papers that are listed for data that have come out of the Commons in the last couple of years. But the real impact, of course, is going to be an increased survival, decreased morbidity and mortality for kids with cancer. And we'll have to figure out ways to measure that impact. But I think we're on the right track. I think the early work that we're seeing really shows that building the Commons has had a significant impact on outcomes. So as I mentioned, we really are being asked now to apply our approach beyond pediatric cancer. And our approach works, of course, anywhere across any disease type, but it's especially useful for rare diseases and rare subtypes. We found that it's not so important to try to pitch a breast cancer data commons because breast cancer is unfortunately very common. And so any particular health system has thousands and thousands of cases that they can use to put together to build a registry or a database that's going to help with analyses and interpretation. But where I think this is key is in rare subtypes of common diseases or rare diseases. And I think we're starting to see more groups come. I know we're starting to see more groups come to us asking us to help with this. After I talk about some of the idea of rare diseases and one in particular, I'm going to talk about the sociome because this is a super exciting area for us. I'm sure for many of you, this is going to be a really exciting thing to hear about because it's really all the non-clinical data that are associated with health outcomes. And so I'll go into some depth about the sociome. So we were asked to work on a monogenic diabetes data commons, and monogenic diabetes is extremely rare. University of Chicago was one of the institutions to discover monogenic diabetes, and you can only collect a handful of cases from any particular institution. So to study monogenic diabetes, we really they want to build a commons that has 10 times the number of patients. So this was perfect for us because we came to the group and said, listen, let's get together a consortium. Let's put together all the groups in the world that are working on this, and let's try to build a consortium and bring the data together. Let's build a data dictionary. So we're about 6 months into this project. We're already starting to see some interest around the dictionary. We're already bringing together groups to form a consortium here. And I think this is the perfect paradigm case for us that's not pediatric cancer because it allows us to get at a rare subtype of a common disease. And I think we're going to see more and more of these opportunities. In the monogenic diabetes commons, we're going to have clinical data, patient-reported outcomes, which is new for us. So this is surveys that are sent to patients or information that patients enter through, say, the MyChart portal. And we're also going to start to integrate data from wearables and sensors. In this case, things like continuous glucose monitors that patients wear to continually monitor their blood glucose levels and perhaps work with an insulin pump. We're working with the UChicago Kovler Diabetes Center, which is a world-renowned diabetes group. And so they actually have access to the data here as well as the contacts from around the world. And our tried and true methods are working. Building the consortia, creating the dictionary, developing the governance, it's all translatable. It's all the same kind of work, whether it's for pediatric cancer or for diabetes, the same methods apply. All right, so I wanted to finish up talking about the sociome. The sociome is something that we've taken head on in the past year, and I think is going to really revolutionize the way we think about doing research into disease and health. We all have heard about social determinants of health, and some of those social determinants are listed on the left, but the sociome is more than that. The sociome is the entire lived experience of the individual. So is the patient in a loving home, or is the home chaotic? Is the patient being treated in an area that has high pollution, or are they being treated in an area that's very clean? If somebody is experiencing a lot of exertion every day. Is that exertion because they're an exercise instructor or because they're on a heavy labor crew? I would argue that those might have different outcomes for that patient. And the sociome is likely to have enormous impact on how we think about responses to therapy. One of the questions that we all need to ask is, if you're getting cancer immunotherapy, does it matter if you live, near the old steel mills in Gary, Indiana, or does it matter if you live up on the North Shore where there's much less pollution? There's a lot of confounding factors there that we need to control for, but is pollution an important aspect of this? There's been some work already looking at things like blood pressure and living in a high crime area, and does moving away from a high crime area affect your blood pressure? It turns out it does. So that's an example of a one-off project using some sociome data. And we're trying to create a sociome commons that anyone can use to answer any type of question. And again, this is a perfect project for our group because we have the experience to bring together these types of data. The paradigm project we're working on, or the pilot we're working on, is looking at asthma. And so think of the kid that lives in this apartment building above a highway on the left, and all the diesel and pollution that child may be exposed to through open windows, and compare that to a child that lives in the house in the suburbs on the right. Perhaps they both have the exact same kind of asthma, but they may have very different outcomes based on factors that relate to their sociome. And that's what we're trying to get at, is understanding how do we measure and control for and model those factors. This is just a quick example. On the left is plotting data around Chicago of things like traffic and park space and air quality and crime. The second panel is an amazing data set from our geospatial group showing a plot of every single tree in Chicago. So we know exactly where the tree canopies are and where the sunlight areas are. And then the right two panels are very interesting in showing the areas with the most extreme poverty in Chicago in the third panel, the darker orange and brown areas. And then on the right are areas where we have a lot of missing data. So the areas that are green and yellow are areas where we have a lot of missing sparse data. So it's important to understand that the populations that may have the most impact from upstream factors may be the areas where we have the worst data. And so understanding that is going to be important to building the sociome commons. These are just some of the kinds of data sets that we're collecting for the sociome commons. It's the obvious things like traffic and weather, but it's also things like where the after school programs are, where are the flu shot locations, where are the food deserts. It's very exciting to us. We've looked at hundreds of data sets. We're building this really live resource where somebody can come in and say, you know what, I want to study migraines and I want to understand how humidity affects that. Well, we're set up to bring in that kind of data and more importantly, connect the data to the clinical data. So we know where a patient lives, we know when they were there, and we now have the sociome data to connect there. And so that kind of geocoding and connection is exactly what the sociome commons is going to be used for. And in the end, these are the kinds of questions we want to answer. So it may be something as simple as having a kid walk to school in a different path may be important to controlling their asthma. So working with city planners may be something that is key to the work that we're doing. For pediatric cancer in particular, I think collecting these types of data is going to be critical because I think we do a good job of collecting the clinical data, but we don't do a very good job of collecting these non-clinical data. And I can tell you as a clinician, if I have a patient that does not live near a 24-hour pharmacy, that puts them at much higher risk for bouncing back to the emergency department. And I never see that data point listed anywhere in discharge papers. You know, how far away do you live to a 24-hour pharmacy? That's the kind of non-clinical data that we should be collecting and using because it can be hugely predictive of outcomes for kids. So I just wanted to give you an overview of where we're going. Again, none of this dilutes our mission for pediatric cancer, which is laser focused. I hope it just gets you excited about the areas that we can move into that are going to help enhance our mission. Okay, so just to bring us back into PCDC here, we have our Common Good seminar, and Hopefully you've been able to see the talks from Sam Blackman and Adam Resnick and Greg Simon. They're all on our YouTube channel. Our next talk is by Dr. Carlos Rodriguez Galindo, that many of you know is one of the world's experts in global pediatric oncology. Dr. Pritchard-Jones mentioned him a couple times during her remarks, and he's going to give us a talk during our next Common Good seminar in July on the landscape of pediatric oncology clinical trials. There's a short link to all the videos and our YouTube channel. Please sign up for our newsletters. We have, I think, over 1,000 people now that get our quarterly newsletters. And you know, we have jobs open. We love having people join the team. If anybody's interested in working more closely with the PCDC, please let us know. You're welcome to explore our data portal. Right now, it's rather limited in the amount of data in there, but as I said, it's going to be exploding over the next few months. So please check out the Data Commons portal. All of our dictionaries are open source and published. They're shareable. You're welcome to download them and to use them. And then you're welcome to email Kat or myself or anybody on the PCDC team if you want to get involved with any of the consortia, fundraising, volunteering. We'd love to have you involved. We, of course, are always trying to expand our footprint and trying to keep our projects going. I didn't talk at all today about sustainability, but sustainability is becoming more and more important now that we've established the Commons. Bobby works very closely with us and with the university to help find partners to help fund our research. And we would love to have people give us ideas or help us with grants and so forth. I mentioned our funders from the last year up front. We've been just so lucky to work with an incredible group of funders that not only, of course, you know, write the check, which is important, but are involved, that ask us questions, that challenge us, that give us the opportunity to give talks to their groups. It's just been a great back and forth and two-way street with our funders to promote the work that we're doing. And then I briefly mentioned that we're super excited to work with Leidos and the NCI on upcoming contract work to help support the National Cancer Institute's mission. Okay, so I'm going to pause, and I want to introduce a few other people. You've met Caitlin and Kat already, and you've met Dr. Pritchard-Jones and Kirk, but a few other folks are on today. So Ellen Cohn is our Senior Director of Academic Operations. She's been with the PCDC over a year now and really has been instrumental in helping pull so many aspects of our work together. Susie Burrs runs our regulatory data and governance work. I've worked with Susie for over 10, 12 years now, and Susie is the master of everything, and we've been super lucky to have her driving forward the progress of our data sharing agreements. And the story I like to tell is that I always assumed that our bottleneck was going to be data sharing agreements and contracts. And Susie proved me wrong, because our bottleneck now is data harmonization, because Susie has driven these agreements forward at a pace that I never could have predicted or hoped for. It may seem slow to her or to the rest of it, but trust me, it's been breakneck in the world of legal agreements. Michael Watkins came on about a year ago to the PCDC as a senior clinical data standards analyst. Michael was a tremendous find. He's a PhD in bioinformatics, but has a specific interest in ontologies and genomic ontologies. And I could not hope for a more perfect unicorn to join our team, because he's been absolutely instrumental in helping keep our data standards work going. And then Brian Ferner, you all know, has been with us since the start. He's the architect of building the original data commons and is a master of data harmonization and standards, and has become really a nationally known expert in the area of healthcare ontologies. And so we've been extremely lucky to have Brian. So I can kick off and ask a question. One of the things that we get asked a lot is, how can new investigators or new contributors join the PCDC? And you know, we're working with a very tried and true group of pediatric oncologists from COG and from SIOP and from, you know, EPSSG and all these groups that we've been working with. But if there's a new group or a new user, what is the best way for them to get involved? And can anybody ask for data? And what is our approach to interested users, whether they're contributors or researchers? I don't know if Susie, you want to kick that off, or if anybody else wants to answer that.
Hi, sure. Hi, everyone. So I guess there's two aspects to that. For data contributors, for new diseases, I think it's call Sam, call Sam, call Sam, right? New diseases. And then Sam will take all the information, and we'll go through an intake process to see how the new disease, whether it's cancer or non-cancer, fits into the PCDC and how we can move forward. For data contributors for disease that already exists, we also have a process for that. Each consortia, each disease consortia has an executive committee who has been vested with the authority to determine what data would be brought into that disease consortia. And then we have a process for profiling that data, bringing that information to the executive committee, and determining the fit and making sure that the data match up with the data dictionary and can be harmonized and added in. And so we do have a authority setting, which is that's through the disease executive committee, and we have a process for collecting that information. We encourage everybody to reach out. You can certainly reach out to anyone on this call, and we'll connect you with the appropriate disease. On the PCDC website, each disease consortia has a contact person, a project manager or program manager, and you can reach out to that disease directly. For accessing data, we also have a process that should be no surprise. What you would do is go through the data portal and create a cohort, figure out if there's enough data in the PCDC to answer your question. You would complete a form. Right now, this is a manual process. There's a word-based form. You'd complete the form, send it to the person whose contact information is at the top. I can tell you for all of the data in the PCDC right now, that is me. So you would send that to me, and I would route it to either neuroblastoma or Instruct for soft tissue sarcoma. And we would take that to the executive committees. They each have a process for reviewing those projects and bringing those projects to acceptance or revision. And then after that, we create data use agreements with each of those institutions who will be getting the raw data, and then we provide the data and the research can commence. For younger investigators or newer investigators to data type projects, if you want to be involved, but you do not have an idea, you can also reach out to me and I can connect you with the executive committees of those, that particular disease. And they may have a project that's been waiting in the wings, but for which they don't have enough investigators to follow through on that research, or they might have a senior investigator who's been looking for someone to help them out. We, the PCDC and all the investigators with whom we've been working, loosely define new investigators. I think we take the COG model, which is if you think you're a young investigator, you're a young investigator. So we don't put an age limit on it. We don't put a number of papers or research on it. So that's how that happens. We do have to put data use agreements in place for anybody with whom we will be giving raw data, because that's the promise that we make to our data contributors. And we have data contributor agreements in which we make that promise. I think I answered everything, but if I left anything out, let me know.
Thanks, Susie. I mean, I think you illustrate how important it is that we have a process, but that we're open to anyone contacting us to go through the process, which I think is important. I wanted to ask Brian and Michael a question about our standards. It comes up often that somebody says, have you tried to use standard X, or have you used this standard, and why aren't you using this standard? And my answer has always been, well, as long as you use some standard, you'll be okay, because we can always interoperate. But I think that might be a naive answer. What are both of you, what is your approach to questions about how we decide which standard to use and whether we're using the right standard or whether we shouldn't be using ENCODE or some other standard that's out there?
Yeah, I can take a first stab.
Yeah,
Brian.
go for it, Michael. That'd be great.
It's a great question, and it's important that the standards community is kind of evolving in that sense to where it's more and more acceptable to have several code systems, marked as synonymous and have collections of several codes across several systems, rather than just picking one or using one as de facto, since there are quite a spread of standards that are used in different ways. And there are different architectures and things that take advantage of that, different ways to bind value sets and have multiple coding systems within a single value set. But like I said, it's an iterative process. It really depends on how the data is being encoded at the different institutions. We look at different common data models and how those models are representing maybe similar concepts to what we have in PCDC. So we might draw from that things like OMOP or MCode or SDTM. We might look at how those models are binding values. But there is going to be a space, since we are more of a specialty with pediatric cancer, there's going to be a space where there aren't adequate codes or code systems that exist. And for that, it's been really helpful for us to have a close relationship with the National Cancer Institute and the NCIT, the thesaurus that was mentioned earlier, as a place where we can formulate new concepts that we're discovering through this process of these detailed conversations that we have with our disease groups. So we can always have a place to create new codes, but obviously we don't want to create new codes if there are existing codes. And so pulling those synonymous codes is an important part, but iterative is probably the best word that I can use. And Brian probably has more to say about it.
No, I think that's right. I mean, there's also, certainly one can, in many cases, navigate from data that have been collected or bound to a certain code set or certain terminology, and move from that space into a space that's bound to a different terminology. But usually there's some loss, some information loss in that transformation. And so as few of those transformations as one can do, generally the better off that you are. And I think there is some tension inherent in capturing data from multiple sources where they may be captured at potentially different levels of granularity, and wanting to be able to support this ability to sort of aggregate up or get down to lower levels of granularity. So that is definitely a tension that we encounter during the work of building out our dictionary, and that comes into play when we're having discussions with disease groups about building out their dictionaries, is choosing the most appropriate level of specificity for the groups that have, especially groups that are going to be contributing historic data that may not just be, it just may be impossible for them to bind those data to highly granular information.
All right, thanks Brian, thanks Michael. I want to switch gears a little bit and ask a question about patient advocacy groups. We've talked a lot about getting closer connections to families. I mentioned it in talking about long-term follow-up, and I think we have a great opportunity to work directly with families, whether it's through GEARBOx or through a patient navigator or long-term follow-up. Maybe Kat, maybe you want to give us your thoughts about how we can try to engage families better, or what's the best way to utilize patient advocacy organizations.
Yeah, so I think that this is something that the PCDC as a group has been thinking about for a couple of years now, and hopefully we'll be able to bring some of those thoughts and plans to fruition in the next year or so. We did a baseline project with a student and a couple patient advocacy organizations to understand how patients and families currently feel about data collection and big data and some of these large-scale initiatives that the PCDC is a part of. And that was really illuminating for our team, just to understand what the baseline is and how people are thinking about the type of work that we are trying to pursue. I think in the future, there's a lot of opportunity to involve the actual patients and families in some of the committees and boards that we're putting together. For example, on the SAC that Jamie presented on earlier, we just recently added a patient advocate who will be able to share a unique perspective among the many oncologists and researchers on that group. And we also have been discussing plans for an all-patient group, whether that is an internal PCDC group, or if we reach out to other patient advocacy organizations or patient groups at other institutions to get some very important feedback on some of the tools and resources we're developing. So yeah. I think a lot of more work to come in that area and involving more patients in our work.
Yeah, thanks, Kat. I think that's spot on. We'd love to get more input from patients and parents and advocates. So please reach out if you want to help us get connected that way. A quick question for you, Alan. You've really helped me rethink about how we look at education and training in the PCDC. And I know every single day I send you another email about, can we bring on yet another trainee or med student or fellow or resident? And we've even worked with people all over the world now. How do you think about our educational mission and how we can best serve the community? I think we've had undergrads. I think we might even have a high schooler next year come work with us. So there's got to be a method though, and I've really appreciated your approach in helping us think through that.
Thank you for asking me to think about this often, all day, every day. And it's something that that is near and dear to me. The university, we are embedded in a university, and a university's mission tends to be three-part. One is discovery, another one is training, and then the other is conveying those discoveries through a number of different mechanisms through outreach. I like to think of the first two, well, they're all intertwined, but I like to think of the first two in particular as being dependent on each other. And there are ways for us to formalize how we bring people in and expose them to the work that we're doing. There's the benefit of working with this group in particular is that it's highly attractive. Many people seek us out before we've had the opportunity to create these formal mechanisms. But there's a whole industry and literature around mentorship and the pipeline of training to generate independence. Michael is at the far end. We brought him in as a postdoc, and then we absorbed him right into the staff right away. But that pipeline really does begin in K through 12 education. So the fact that we might bring somebody in from high school is an outstanding initiation to exposing trainees at every level to what are the formal aspects of what they need to learn, and then apply it to the next level, and creating independence at each different stage so that they can become contributors and then maybe become informaticians like Kirk, and governance people like Susie, communication specialists like Caitlin, software gurus like Brian, and operations gurus. So it's a process that I'm super interested in, and it is, as you mentioned, I think central to what we do, and I think of it as central to our organization.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, and it's been really fun working with you on developing this training program, and I'll mention specifically that the medical students have been. We've provided a path for third-year medical students to take a gap year and work with us, and they've been an incredible resource. I think we've had 3 or 4 in a row now, and they've been an incredible resource for our group, and we hope to continue that line of training. Maybe we'll ask one more question and then we'll get finished up. But maybe Kirk, your foray into the analytics part of this has been really interesting for me to watch, and you've had to deal with lots of different stakeholders, and let's just say lots of different personalities, and you've been able to develop, I think, a really great rapport with the groups. when we think about serving analytics, I think most people think about serving the expert user. You know, somebody's going to open up a Python Jupyter notebook and do this kind of work. But there's really a whole spectrum, right? And there's probably a group of clinicians out there that really just want to press a button or just want to see this compared to that. And I think that's where there's a lot of danger, right? Is having a button without a lot of explanation. So I know I'm putting you on the spot here a bit, but how are you thinking about how we can serve the various communities, or should we go all in on just one kind of community when it comes to offering tools?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. You know, I think one of the ways that I view the analytics tools is really as an engagement tool. If you are a established researcher and you have an experienced statistician, it's pretty straightforward for you to just submit a project request and download the data. And I think what's great about these analytics tools is it allows people to get their feet wet and to explore the data with a very low barrier to entry. But as you mentioned, we want to make sure that users are exploring the data responsibly. And users may not be aware that they may be violating some statistical principle as they're exploring the data. And so that's why one of the key points of emphasis that we have as we've developed these risk mitigation strategies is education. And we think that's really the cornerstone is increasing data literacy. And we've developed a statistical manual, which is a very detailed manual that outlines some of the statistical considerations, but then we've also tried to distill the key points into these videos that you've mentioned. And so we have a series of videos that are between 2 and 5 minutes long, exploring some of these concepts, so that we hope that by providing all those details in the written manual that users can refer to, but also distilling those concepts, the important concepts, into the videos, that we're going to be able to ensure that users understand these key concepts and are exploring the data in a responsible manner.
All right, thanks, Kirk. Yeah, I think it's going to be an exciting year. There's so many cool innovations coming down the line that I think we're going to have. It's going to be up to us to decide how much we want to put in place. But I think we're nearing the end. I just want to, before I hand it back over to Caitlin, I just want to especially thank Caitlin and Kat for all their help in putting this together. This is obviously a huge undertaking, and we had great representation today from across our group of funders and from scientists, and just super gratifying to see everyone involved. And thanks to everybody here who presented, obviously. Thanks to Ajay and Dr. Pritchard-Jones, and to Raj, and to Jamie for their great talks, and to all the panelists here. So super excited for what's coming up. And Caitlin, I'll send it back to you and you can take us home.
Thanks, Sam. And I'd just like to echo Sam's thanks to all our speakers today, and to thank everyone who joined us today and listened. As we mentioned, we will be sending around a recording of this webinar, and we'll have all the materials from today available on our website. And that will include a transcript of the Q&A questions that were answered via the text function. When you close your browser window, or when I end this webinar, a survey will pop up in your browser, and we'd love your feedback. Any of the questions that you feel like answering, all the questions are optional, so you can pick and choose, but we'd love to hear what you think. And if you have any other questions for us that weren't answered today, please feel free to reach out to us anytime. You can get in touch with us via our website. You can reply back to me when I send out the follow-up email from this later this week, and I'll make sure your question gets to the right person. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks again, everyone, and we hope to see you soon at other events.